It began with an image no one could forget. In the center of a quiet stone square, beneath the cracked shadow of a Virgin Mary statue, a small puppy trembled. Its fur was matted with dust, its ribs showing beneath thin skin. And yet, instead of collapsing in the corner like the other strays often did, this puppy pressed its two tiny paws against the statue's base, upward, steady, almost as if in prayer. What happened next would ripple far beyond that forgotten square. The village of Santa Aurelia had long since lost its sound. Once, bells rang daily from the church tower. Once, the streets were alive with vendors calling out their wares and children chasing each other beneath the trees. But that was years ago, before the factory closed, before families moved away, before the church itself locked its doors when the last priest grew too old to stand at the altar. Now the square sat in silence, save for the occasional flutter of pigeons or the uneven shuffle of an old woman crossing to buy bread. Windows were shuttered. Shops carried more dust than goods. The Virgin Mary, carved from weathered limestone centuries earlier, stood at the square's heart, her face softened by rain and time, her arms open in perpetual welcome. Few noticed her anymore. She was just there, like the cracked stones beneath their feet. Until the puppy came. No one saw where it had come from. Some whispered later that it must have wandered from the forest on the edge of town. Others swore they'd seen a flash of golden fur darting between alleyways days before. But all agreed on one thing. The moment it pressed its paws against the Virgin Mary's statue, something in the air shifted. The first to notice was an elderly widow named Rosa Delgado. She had lived all her 82 years in Santa Aurelia and carried them like stones in her bones. Each morning, she walked with a wicker basket to the bakery that barely kept its doors open. That day, she paused mid-step when she saw the puppy. It stood so still, front paws lifted onto the cool stone, head tilted up toward Mary's face. Its body trembled, but not from cold. It trembled like a child fighting back tears. Rosa clutched her basket tighter. For a moment, her breath caught. "Madre de Dios," she whispered. She thought of her late husband, of the son who had left for the city decades ago and never returned. Something in the sight pressed against her heart like a forgotten memory. Then came the children. Two brothers, Mateo and Lucas, walked home from school with books under their arms, kicking pebbles across the square. Lucas stopped first. "Look," he whispered, tugging at his older brother's sleeve. Mateo rolled his eyes, until he saw it too. Both boys grew quiet, their usual chatter silenced as they stared at the strange scene. The shopkeeper, Senor Alvarez, stepped out of his store across the square, wiping flour from his apron. He frowned, expecting to shoo away another stray. But he didn't move. The puppy wasn't scavenging or begging. It wasn't whining. It simply pressed itself upward, paws outstretched, eyes fixed on the Virgin's weathered face. The square held its breath. Minutes passed, but no one stepped forward. It was as if they were all bound by an invisible thread, afraid to disturb what they saw. The puppy's small chest rose and fell quickly, its thin body quivering. Its paws slid once against the stone, then steadied again, clinging as though it knew this was the only anchor left in the world. A breeze stirred, carrying the faint smell of smoke from a chimney and the sharper tang of earth after rain. The Virgin Mary statue cast a long shadow over the puppy, stretching across the stones like a veil. Rosa felt her throat tighten. She wanted to step forward, to scoop up the trembling creature, but her feet refused to move. Something held her in place, not fear, but reverence. It was Matteo who finally spoke. "It's praying," he whispered. His brother nudged him, half in protest, half in awe. "Dogs don't pray." But even as he said it, he wasn't sure. The shopkeeper shifted uncomfortably, glancing toward the bakery, then back again. He crossed himself quietly. Rosa's eyes watered. Around them, more villagers began to notice. A young woman carrying laundry paused in the alley. An old man leaning on his cane stopped mid-step. One by one, they turned their heads toward the statue, toward the puppy pressing itself so desperately against it. No one spoke loudly. No one dared break the silence that seemed to thrum like a heartbeat across the square. And then something remarkable happened. The church bell, long rusted and silent in its tower, gave a faint groan. It didn't ring, not fully, but the sound echoed faintly, enough to make Matteo gasp, enough to make Rosa's knees tremble. They looked up, half expecting to see the bell swinging, but it was still. Only the wind moved through it, sighing like a breath released after years of holding still. The puppy whimpered once, a high, aching sound. Then it pressed closer to the statue, laying its head against the stone base, as if surrendering completely. Its tiny body shivered, but it did not fall away. By now, a small crowd had gathered. Perhaps a dozen people stood in the square, each frozen in place. Some crossed themselves. Others whispered prayers they hadn't spoken in years. And some simply watched, uncertain but unable to turn away. The square that had been empty for so long now pulsed with quiet wonder. No one knew what the next moment would bring. They only knew that something had begun. Something fragile, something unexplainable, something that demanded to be remembered. And so it was. The day the puppy pressed its paws against the Virgin Mary statue, the people of Santa Aurelia saw more than a stray. They saw desperation turned into prayer. They saw silence turned into witness. They saw a forgotten square breathe again. What they didn't know, what they couldn't yet know, was that this trembling act would draw them into a story far greater than themselves. A story that would begin with a puppy, but would not end there. By evening, the story had already begun to spread. At first, it was just Rosa Delgado, walking home with her empty basket, replaying the scene in her mind. She told herself she wouldn't mention it. People would laugh, call her old and fanciful. But when she passed the little cafe where three women sat shelling beans, the words escaped before she could swallow them. "The puppy prayed before Mary," she murmured. One of the women looked up, blinking. "What?" "It put its paws on the statue." As if. Rosa trailed off, shaking her head, unsure how to finish. "As if what?" the woman pressed. "As if it were asking for help," Rosa said at last, her voice trembling. The beans fell from the woman's hand. The second muttered a prayer under her breath. The third gave a quick laugh, though it didn't carry conviction. "Dogs don't pray, Senora." "Maybe not," Rosa replied, "but I saw it with my own eyes." By nightfall, the square was no longer empty. A few curious souls lingered near the statue, whispering to each other, pointing toward the ground where the puppy had stood. The little creature itself had disappeared into the alleys, but the memory of its trembling paws clung to the stones like a shadow. The next morning, Santa Aurelia buzzed with the kind of murmurs it hadn't heard in years. At the bakery, the miller's wife leaned across the counter. "My cousin says she saw it too," she told Alvarez, the shopkeeper, head bowed, paws lifted, like a child before its mother. Alvarez scowled, more out of discomfort than disbelief. "It was only a stray, probably begging for scraps. Then why didn't it beg at your door?" she challenged. Why there? Why before her? He had no answer. Children carried the tale faster than any adult could. At school, Matteo and Lucas told their classmates what they'd seen. It stood so still, Matteo insisted, like it knew what it was doing. Some children widened their eyes in wonder. Others snickered. One boy, older and sharper-tongued, sneered. It was just tired, probably leaned against the stone before it fell asleep. No, Lucas shot back. It wasn't leaning. It was praying. By the end of the day, the phrase had taken on a life of its own. The puppy prayed before Mary. Not everyone welcomed the story. Don Hector, who prided himself as the village rationalist, scoffed loudly in the tavern that night. Superstition, he barked, slamming his cup of wine. First, it's a dog praying. Next, you'll say the statue winked. You all want miracles because you've forgotten how to work for real change. A few men nodded, but others stayed quiet, staring into their drinks, unwilling to dismiss what they'd heard. One finally whispered, "Still, it's strange, no?" Don Hector rolled his eyes. Strange, yes. Holy, no. Meanwhile, Rosa Delgado sat by her small window, staring into the dark square. Loneliness pressed against her bones, as it always did. Her house was silent, her table set for one. But tonight, her mind replayed the puppy's trembling form over and over. She could not shake the feeling that she had witnessed something meant not just for the town, but for her. Her husband had died years ago. Her son had left without farewell. For so long, she had prayed before that very statue, her whispered pleas drifting unanswered into the night. And then she had stopped. Her prayers dried up, replaced by silence. But now, a starving puppy had done what she had not. It had approached Mary, paws pressed as if in faith. And Rosa felt, for the first time in decades, that maybe heaven had not forgotten her after all. By the third day, the square was no longer just a place of passing. It had become a place of gathering. Mothers brought their children to see where it had happened. Young men lingered awkwardly, pretending not to care, but glancing often at the statue. An old farmer left a bowl of water near the base, in case the puppy returned. Someone lit a candle, then another. No one declared it a miracle, not yet. But the air around the Virgin Mary felt different. Lighter, watchful. That night, as dusk sank into shadow, a small group gathered in silence. Rosa stood among them, her wrinkled hands gripping her cane. She wasn't sure why she had come. She told herself it was just curiosity. But when she saw the flickering light of the candles at Mary's feet, her eyes filled with tears. "She sent the puppy," whispered a young mother, clutching her daughter's hand. "How can you know?" someone asked. "Because who else would?" the mother said simply. The crowd fell silent as footsteps approached. It was Father Gabriel, the retired priest, who had long since stepped back from service. He walked slowly, his hair white, his cassock faded. He hadn't preached in years. "I hear there are stories," and he said softly, his voice carrying in the still air, "stories of a puppy who prayed." A nervous laugh rippled through the crowd, but Father Gabriel didn't smile. His eyes lingered on the statue, on the faint shadows dancing against her stone face. "Maybe it was nothing," he said. "Maybe it was chance." He paused. "Or maybe it was a reminder. That prayer can come even from the smallest, the weakest, the forgotten." No one spoke. The only sound was the quiet crackle of the candles. By now, the phrase was no longer just a rumor. It had become a refrain. The puppy prayed before Mary. Some repeated it with wonder, some with mockery, but all repeated it. And in Santa Aurelia, a town that had forgotten how to speak of faith, the name of Mary was once again on every tongue. Rosa returned home that night with something unfamiliar fluttering in her chest. Hope. It frightened her, fragile as glass, but it was there. For the first time in years, she whispered aloud before bed. "If you can hear even a puppy," she said, "then maybe you can hear me too." And though the night was silent, Rosa slept with a peace she hadn't felt in decades. The square had changed. The village had changed. And though no one yet realized it, the trembling paws of a forgotten puppy had stirred something that would not fade. This was no longer just about an animal. It was about a question that refused to be ignored. What if the Virgin Mary had sent a sign? And if so, what did it mean for them all? It happened on the fourth evening, when the square was hushed in the amber light of sunset. Rosa Delgado had gone again, drawn by something she could not name. She told herself it was curiosity, perhaps loneliness, but the truth was simpler. She felt less empty when she stood near the statue now, as though the Virgin's silent gaze carried a warmth she hadn't felt in years. The puppy had returned that day, frail, dusty, its paws sore from wandering, but its eyes bright with something that seemed stronger than hunger. Rosa spotted it first, trotting across the stones toward her. Its tail wagged weakly, a gesture too small to be joyful, but enough to stir her heart. "Ah, you poor thing," Rosa whispered, crouching down with effort. Her old knees protested, but she held her hand out gently. The puppy sniffed her fingers, then pressed its tiny nose against her palm. Its body trembled, but this time it wasn't in fear. It was urgency. Then, to Rosa's surprise, the puppy tugged at her skirt. Its tiny teeth caught the hem, pulling with desperate insistence. "What is it?" Rosa murmured, bewildered. It pulled again, then stepped back a pace, glancing toward the narrow street that led out of the square. Its eyes shone in the fading light. Rosa hesitated. She hadn't wandered far from home in years, but something in the puppy's urgency pierced through her doubt. Slowly, she straightened her back, adjusted her shawl, and followed. The puppy darted ahead, pausing often to make sure she was behind. Rosa shuffled along, cane tapping the stones, heart pounding with the strange conviction that she was being led somewhere she was meant to go. Down the alley, past the shuttered tailor's shop, across the bridge where weeds grew between the cracks. Finally, they reached the edge of town, where rubble from a collapsed granary still lay in a forgotten heap. The puppy barked once, sharp, insistent, then scrambled toward the ruins. Rosa squinted, her breath caught in her chest. Beneath the broken beams, barely visible, lay another dog. The mother. Her fur was dull with ash, her body twisted beneath a fallen plank. She lifted her head weakly as Rosa approached, her eyes dark pools of pain. She tried to rise, but her hind leg bent at an unnatural angle, and she let out a low, broken whimper. Rosa's heart cracked. "Oh, Madre de Dios!" The puppy rushed to its mother's side, licking her face, pawing at the wood as if begging Rosa to help. Rosa's hands trembled. She was old, too weak to lift the heavy plank alone, but she couldn't turn away. Not now. She leaned on her cane and cried out, her voice louder than it had been in years. "Help! Someone please help!" Her call echoed through the empty street. For a moment, silence. Then footsteps. Mateo and Lucas, the schoolboys, appeared first. Their eyes widened at the sight. "It's the puppy's mother," Lucas whispered. Quickly, Rosa urged. We must move this wood. The boys hesitated, fear flickering across their faces. But then they dropped their books and scrambled to help. Together, with Rosa guiding them, they heaved against the plank. Their young muscles strained, their voices grunted in effort. Inch by inch, the beam lifted. The mother dog whimpered again, dragging herself forward just enough for Rosa to pull her free. She collapsed into the dust, chest heaving, her puppy pressing against her side. By now, others had gathered, drawn by Rosa's cry, by the sight of the old widow kneeling in the rubble with two boys. The shopkeeper Alvarez, a young woman with her laundry still under her arm. Even Don Hector, the skeptic. They all stood in silence, watching as Rosa cradled the injured dog's head in her lap. She would have died here, Rosa said softly, if not for him. She nodded toward the puppy, whose tiny chest rose and fell with frantic devotion. Someone fetched a blanket. Another brought a bowl of water. The townsfolk, hesitant, awkward, began to help. The injured mother drank weakly, then rested her head against Rosa's lap again. The puppy curled close, finally still. The scene was quiet, but charged. No one spoke loudly. No one dared call it a miracle aloud. Yet in their eyes, in the way they lingered, in the reverent hush that fell over the group, the truth was plain. They felt something sacred had happened. It was Don Hector who broke the silence. It was just an animal leading her to another animal, he muttered, though his voice lacked its usual sharpness. No, Rosa said firmly, looking up. Her eyes, usually dim with age, shone with conviction. It was more. The Virgin heard his prayer. The words struck the crowd. Some nodded slowly, others looked away, uncertain, but none dismissed it outright. That night, Rosa carried the memory home like a lantern against her loneliness. She had not expected to feel this way again, alive, needed, part of something larger. As she lay in bed, she whispered into the silence. She suffered, but she was not abandoned. Her words trembled, half prayer, half realization. It echoed the truth she had almost forgotten. The Virgin Mary was not only the Mother of God, but the mother of all who suffer. And in that moment, the injured dog became more than an animal. She became a symbol, a mother in pain, a mother not forsaken. The next morning, the square bloomed with quiet offerings, bowls of food, candles flickering, scraps of cloth for bedding. The mother dog, now resting more comfortably, lay near the statue, her puppy nestled beside her. Children tiptoed close, whispering, as if in church. And for the first time in years, the villagers felt united, not by profit or politics, but by compassion, by a spark that felt divine. It wasn't the statue itself that had changed the town. It was what it witnessed, the helpless leading the forgotten, the weak lifting the weaker, the mother found through mercy. It was small, fragile, easily dismissed. But to those who saw it, it was unmistakable, a miracle. By the end of the week, the square no longer felt empty. Where once silence reigned, the faint glow of candlelight now flickered against the Virgin Mary's weathered face. Bowls of food rested at her feet, not just for the two dogs, but for any stray that might wander by. Small bouquets of wildflowers, tied with bits of twine, leaned gently against the base of the statue. At night, people came quietly, one by one, as though drawn by something they couldn't explain. They didn't speak loudly, didn't laugh. They simply stood, sometimes prayed, sometimes just looked. The square had become a gathering place again, not for commerce or festivals, but for something deeper. It wasn't the stone alone, Rosa whispered one evening, her voice carried only to those closest. It was what it witnessed. The words stuck, they spread, and soon that phrase hung in the air whenever villagers spoke of the statue. The animals were recovering. The mother dog, though limping, gained strength with each day. The puppy, once frail, now wagged its tail with playful energy, delighting children who brought scraps of bread and leftover stew. For many, it felt like a living parable, suffering redeemed, despair turned into joy. Children began naming the dogs. Some called the mother Luz, light. Others called the puppy Esperanza, hope. The names clung, and soon the entire village used them. Luz and Esperanza became symbols not just of survival, but of something reborn in Santa Aurelia. But as faith rekindled, old wounds resurfaced. For years, the village had been divided. The factory's closure had split families, some leaving, others resenting those who stayed. The church's locked doors had driven neighbors apart, some bitter at God, others bitter at each other. And politics had only sharpened the edges. Who was to blame? Who had abandoned whom? Who still carried anger in silence? Now, as people gathered near the statue, those divisions flickered again in the candlelight. Two men who hadn't spoken in a decade stood only steps apart. An old woman whose daughter had married into a rival family found herself shoulder to shoulder with her estranged in-laws. For a moment, tension hung thick, as though the statue had dragged every wound into the open. But then, something unexpected happened. One evening, Mateo and Lucas's mother brought fresh bread for Luz and Esperanza. She knelt to place it by the bowl, brushing shoulders with her neighbor, a woman she hadn't spoken to since their husbands quarreled over land years before. Their eyes met, awkward, heavy with unspoken resentment. Then the puppy trotted between them, wagging its tail as if bridging the gap. Both women laughed softly, surprised by the sound. And just like that, the years of silence cracked. The next night, the two women returned together, carrying stew in one pot instead of two. The same pattern repeated. A farmer who had long accused Alvarez, the shopkeeper, of cheating him on grain weights, stood near him in silence, both watching Luz rest peacefully at Mary's feet. Alvarez muttered, "She looks stronger." The farmer nodded, replying, "Thanks to the food you gave." It was a small exchange, but in a village where grudges had lived longer than friendships, it was enough. Father Gabriel, though retired, came often now. He never preached. He simply sat on a bench near the statue, his hands folded loosely, his lips moving in quiet prayer. People who had not prayed in decades began sitting near him, not asking for guidance, but taking courage from his presence. One night, Rosa approached him. "Do you think this is a miracle?" she asked. The old priest looked at her, his eyes glistening in the candlelight. "Perhaps, but more important is what it has done to us. A miracle is not only in what happens, it is in what it awakens." Rosa nodded, her heart heavy with memory. For the first time, she felt she was part of something larger than her grief, something shared. And yet, doubt still lingered at the edges. Don Hector, ever the skeptic, came one evening, watching as the villagers lit candles. "You think a dog at a statue will fix this town?" he scoffed. No one argued. No one shouted him down. But a young girl, no more than 8, tugged at his sleeve. "Mister," she said softly, pointing at the Virgin's face, "if she can make us kind again, isn't that enough?" Hector froze. He had no reply. That night, though he left quickly, witnesses swore they saw him cross himself before stepping into the shadows. The square, once abandoned, had become a beating heart again. Music crept back, first from a guitar someone strummed quietly near the candles, then from voices singing hymns long forgotten. Neighbors who hadn't shared meals in years brought food, setting tables together beneath the Virgin's gaze. Even the air felt different. Rosa swore the statue seemed to glow faintly at dusk, though others said it was just the reflection of the candles. Some claimed they heard the faint echo of bells in the wind, though the church tower was still rusted and silent. And through it all, Luz and Esperanza remained near the Virgin's feet. The mother dog healed slowly, her limp still visible, but her eyes calm. The puppy grew bold, bounding through the crowd, before always returning to the statue, pressing its paws to the stone, as if reminding everyone why they had gathered in the first place. It wasn't the stone alone, Rosa repeated one evening, her voice strong despite her years. It was what it witnessed. The people nodded. For in truth, the Virgin had not moved, had not spoken. But in her silence, she had become the vessel for something Santa Aurelia had thought lost forever: mercy, compassion, and the courage to see each other again. By the end of that month, the square was no longer a place of absence. It was full of candles, of food, of laughter, of hesitant forgiveness. The Virgin Mary's statue had become the town's center once more, not as an idol, not as stone, but as a witness, a reminder, a mother who did not abandon them. And though no one dared say it aloud, the truth hummed beneath every whispered prayer and every lit candle. If a puppy's trembling paws could awaken a villager's heart, what might come next? By the second month, Santa Aurelia was no longer quiet. What began as whispers in the square had grown into rumors across the region. First came curious neighbors from nearby villages, arriving in pairs to see the puppy and its mother lying at the Virgin's feet. Then came strangers, men with notebooks, women with cameras, their shoes too clean for the dust of the town. And with the outsiders came doubt. One morning, a car with a city logo painted on its door pulled into the square. Out stepped two young officials, their clipboards shining in the sun. They called themselves animal welfare workers. Their concern, they said, was the dogs. They're being used, one of them insisted, scribbling notes as Esperanza darted between children's legs. These villagers are projecting superstition onto helpless animals. The crowd stiffened, bristling. No one forced him to kneel, Rosa said firmly, her voice steady. He did that himself. The workers scoffed. Dogs copy behavior. It isn't a miracle, it's mimicry. But even as she spoke, the puppy pressed its paws against the Virgin's robe again, head bowed, body trembling with something that looked too much like prayer. The villagers exchanged glances. The outsiders shifted uncomfortably, unwilling to call it anything more. Later that week, a journalist from the capital arrived. His name was Antonio Rivera, sharp suit, sharper smile. He set up a tripod across the square and began asking questions in a voice just loud enough for everyone to hear. Is this faith, he asked, turning to his camera, or is this desperation dressed as devotion? A crumbling town, a forgotten statue, a stray animal. Perhaps people need to believe in miracles when all else has failed. The villagers turned away, muttering. Some nodded reluctantly. Others felt the sting of insult, but Antonio's words clung like smoke. Were they clinging too hard? Were they seeing miracles where none existed? The tension deepened as stories of strange occurrences began to spread. It started with a single candle. Matteo, one of the schoolboys, swore he had placed it at the Virgin's feet one night before going home. When he returned the next morning, it was still burning, flame steady, wax untouched. "I swear," he told his teacher, holding the stub in trembling hands, "it didn't melt. Not even a drop." Some believed, others laughed. Don Hector shook his head. "Candles don't disobey the laws of fire," he said. Yet he avoided the square that night. Then came the child's story. A girl no older than 7 tugged on her mother's sleeve during evening prayers. "Mama," she whispered, pointing at the statue. She smiled at Esperanza. The crowd froze. Dozens of eyes turned to the Virgin's marble face. It was the same, serene, unmoving, eyes lowered. Yet the little girl insisted. "I saw it, just for a second." She smiled at the puppy. Her mother hushed her, embarrassed. But whispers rippled through the square. Could a statue carved decades ago have moved? Or had the child seen only what she wanted to? And then the bells. On a Tuesday evening, when the square was crowded with both villagers and outsiders, a sound cut through the twilight. 3 low tolls, deep and heavy, as though rung from a bronze tower. Everyone froze. Rosa clutched her rosary. Father Gabriel lifted his head sharply. But there were no bells in Santa Aurelia. The church's tower had collapsed years before. "Recordings?" Antonio muttered, spinning his camera around. "Someone's playing a trick." Yet no devices were found. Only silence lingered, thick and expectant, after the echoes faded. The village was now split, not between faith and indifference, but between belief and suspicion. At the diner, voices rose. "It's a miracle," someone would say. "Don't you see? She's watching us again." Others snapped back. "You want so badly for it to be real, you're inventing things." Dogs and candles and stories from children, hardly proof. The arguments spilled into streets, into homes, even families divided. Parents scolded children for spreading nonsense. Children scolded parents for not believing enough. And still, every night, the square filled with light. Candles multiplied, flowers bloomed at the Virgin's feet, and the dogs, symbols, now more than animals, remained at the center of it all. One evening, Antonio the journalist caught Rosa outside her home. His tone was sharper than before. "You're the one who first followed the puppy," he said. "Tell me the truth. Isn't this just a story you want to believe?" Rosa's eyes narrowed. "I am old," she said, her voice steady. "I have buried my husband, my son, my youth. I no longer waste my time wanting to believe. I only see what is." "And what is that?" Antonio pressed. Rosa looked at him with a calm that unsettled him. "That sometimes heaven chooses the smallest to show us the greatest, and if you cannot see it, perhaps it is because you are not looking with your heart." But doubt was not easily silenced. The welfare workers filed a report demanding the dogs be removed to a shelter. Villagers resisted. Arguments escalated into near shouting matches in the square. Antonio's news segments painted the town as a desperate community lost in myth. Outsiders mocked them online. And yet, each strange occurrence, each unexplained moment, pulled more people to the statue. The flame that refused to die, the smile a child swore she saw, the bells that rang where no bells stood. The question grew heavier by the day. Was this real? Or was the town clinging to hope too desperately? No one knew. But each evening, more candles were lit, more prayers were whispered, and beneath the Virgin's gaze, doubt and belief tangled together like vines on old stone, impossible to separate. The first raindrops came without warning. All week, the sky had hung heavy, swollen with unfallen clouds. But on Thursday night, as villagers lit their candles at the Virgin's feet, the storm finally broke. At first, it was only a drizzle. Then a crack of thunder split the air, and the heavens opened. Sheets of rain lashed the square, drenching the flowers, scattering flames into smoke. People scrambled for cover beneath balconies and awnings. Children clung to their parents. Yet even as the storm raged, two figures stayed unmoved. Luz and Esperanza, huddled tight at the statue's base, their fur plastered by the downpour, their eyes lifted upward. And above them, the Virgin's marble face glistened, not in ruin, but as though lit from within. By midnight, the storm had worsened. The creek that wound through Santa Aurelia swelled to its banks, carrying branches and debris. Water coursed down cobblestones, seeping into homes. Fear spread quickly. Memories of past floods rose like ghosts. "This is no ordinary storm," someone whispered. "It feels sent." But the greater shock came not from the sky, but from men. At dawn, through the pounding rain, a convoy of trucks rumbled into the square. Officials in bright vests and hard hats jumped down, waving papers in their hands. Their orders were clear. The statue and animals were to be removed at once. For safety, they insisted. The flood zone is dangerous. This gathering puts lives at risk. No one believed them. Their tone was too harsh, their steps too eager. And when they reached for Luz and Esperanza, the crowd erupted. Rosa stepped forward first, her thin frame shaking, but her voice steady. "You will not take them." "Stand aside," one official barked, rain dripping from his helmet. But Rosa did not move. She stood before the Virgin, her cane planted firmly in the mud. Behind her, others joined, mothers with children, farmers with boots caked in soil, shopkeepers still wearing aprons. One by one, they formed a barrier around the statue, hands linked, backs unyielding. "You'll drown out here," the officials warned. "Better with her," Rosa replied, "than without her." The rain hammered harder, the square a chaos of water and shouting. Lightning flared overhead, illuminating the faces of those who stood in defiance. And in that moment, Rosa's voice rose above the storm, frail yet unshakable. "If you save us, we will keep you here forever." Her vow hung in the air, fierce and desperate, echoing words spoken by ancestors long before. Some villagers crossed themselves, others wept openly. The outsiders faltered, unnerved by the unity before them. And then the climax came. A roar shook the night. The floodwaters broke through the northern edge of the town, surging down streets with unstoppable force. Wooden carts were swept away. Stalls collapsed. A barn's roof tore free, vanishing into the torrent. People screamed, scattering toward higher ground. The officials fled to their trucks, shouting orders drowned out by thunder. But in the square, something impossible happened. The waters split. The flood surged around the Virgin's pedestal, rushing like a furious tide. But the statue itself stood dry. The ground at her base was soaked, yet no wave touched her feet. And there, still trembling but alive, Luz and Esperanza clung to her side, untouched by the chaos tearing the town apart. Witnesses would later swear the Virgin glowed faintly, her marble robes shimmering as though reflecting a light that no lightning had cast. Others claimed they saw her eyes, lowered in eternal stone, shift upward, just for a breath. Rosa herself collapsed to her knees, hands raised. "She is with us," she cried. "Do you not see? She is with us." The villagers, drenched and shivering, gathered again at her feet. Some prayed aloud, others simply stared in awe. The officials, stunned, dared not step closer. Their authority had drowned in the very waters they feared. By dawn, the storm eased. The rain slowed to a drizzle, then ceased entirely. The floodwaters receded as suddenly as they had risen, leaving mud, broken branches, and scattered debris across Santa Aurelia. Homes were damaged, roads torn, but in the square, the Virgin still stood, her marble robes gleaming against the pale morning light. At her feet, Luz shook her wet fur and curled protectively around Esperanza, both alive, both unharmed. It was not just survival, it was defiance. Against storm, against flood, against men who tried to take them. The town gathered in stunned silence, staring at the scene. The widow's vow, spoken into the storm, now felt sealed by heaven itself. "If you save us," Rosa whispered again, her voice breaking, "we will keep you here forever." And the people answered, not with words, but with candles. Even in the damp dawn, they lit them. Hundreds of tiny flames trembling against the wind, surrounding the Virgin's pedestal until the square glowed once more. For the first time in years, Santa Aurelia was not divided. There were no arguments of proof or coincidence, no sneers of doubt, only the shared memory of what they had seen, the storm that drowned everything but her, the dogs that lived when they should have perished, the statue that remained untouched while chaos raged all around. It was no longer just belief, it was testimony. News spread quickly. Outsiders who had come to mock fell silent. Antonio, the journalist, lowered his camera, his sharp words gone. He muttered to no one in particular, "If this is coincidence, then it is the most merciful coincidence I've ever seen." And though skeptics still clung to their doubt, something had shifted. What happened in that storm could not be argued away. It had carved itself into memory, into story, into faith. From that day forward, the square was never empty again, because now the people of Santa Aurelia knew their lady had not abandoned them, and neither would they abandon her. The storm passed, but its memory never did. Santa Aurelia did not look the same in the weeks that followed. The streets still bore scars of the flood, mud-caked walls, broken fences, a roof half-torn from the bakery. Yet when people spoke of that night, their voices did not tremble with fear. They spoke with reverence. For while water had swallowed half the town, the square stood unbroken. The Virgin remained untouched, and the two strays, mother and pup, lived as if carried in invisible arms. At first, the town kept the miracle to itself. Outsiders had brought doubt, and no one wished to cheapen what they had witnessed with mockery. But stories have wings, and this one flew farther than anyone imagined. Travelers began arriving, first a trickle, then a steady flow. Not tourists with cameras, but pilgrims with quiet eyes. They came from neighboring villages, then from cities hours away. Some came limping. Some came carrying photographs of loved ones. Others brought nothing but silence. They lit candles at the Virgin's feet, placed flowers beside Luz and Esperanza, and left again without fanfare. The square, once the loneliest place in town, became its beating heart. Esperanza grew quickly, her once wobbly legs strong, her fur glossy in the sun. But she never strayed far. Each day she could be found lying near the pedestal, sometimes resting her head on the stone, as though listening. Luce, her mother, stayed close as well. The two of them, like guardians, living reminders of the night mercy touched the town. Children adored them. They braided ribbons into their collars, fed them scraps of bread, and whispered secrets into their ears. Adults treated them with a quiet respect, stepping carefully around them as if they were part of the statue itself. "They are not just dogs anymore," Rosa said once. "They are witnesses." And Rosa herself was changed. For years, loneliness had been her shadow. She had eaten meals in silence, lit candles for a family long buried, walked home each night with no one waiting. But now, when she entered the square, children called her Abuela. Neighbors saved her a seat. The once empty rooms of her heart filled with voices, laughter, and the warmth of belonging. "I prayed for purpose," she whispered one evening at the Virgin's feet. "And you gave me more than purpose. You gave me back my people." Her eyes glistened as Esperanza curled beside her, paws folded as if in prayer. The children of Santa Aurelia spoke differently now too, no longer of leaving, of finding work elsewhere, of escaping a forgotten town. They spoke of hope, of staying, of building. "Do you think she watches us all the time?" Matteo asked one night, squinting at the Virgin's marble face. "Yes," another child replied, without hesitation, "even when we don't see it." And in their voices, the tired resignation that had once haunted the town was gone. Even the skeptics softened. Don Hector, who had scoffed the loudest, began arriving early each morning with fresh flowers for the pedestal. He never prayed aloud, but once, when asked why he bothered, he muttered, because even if it was coincidence, it was a merciful one. And mercy deserves thanks. Antonio the journalist returned quietly, without his camera crew. He sat at the back of the square one evening, watching candles flicker in the dusk. When someone asked him what he saw, he answered only, "Something I can't put into words." The town itself began to heal. Where arguments had once divided, cooperation bloomed. Farmers who had lost crops were helped by neighbors with fuller harvests. The church, long empty, opened its doors again, not with booming sermons, but with humble prayer services. And the Virgin statue remained the center, not of ritual, but of gathering. It wasn't about spectacle, it was about solace. Seasons turned. The square blossomed with flowers in spring, shimmered with candles in summer, glowed with lanterns in autumn, and stood serene against the snow of winter. Luce grew grey around her muzzle. Esperanza grew strong, tall, her eyes watchful. And always, they stayed near the Virgin, like sentinels who understood their duty. And through it all, Rosa smiled more than she ever had in her life. One night, months later, she stood before the statue, leaning on her cane, the square filled with pilgrims. She listened to the murmurs of prayer, the laughter of children, the quiet hum of life. And she whispered a thought that had grown inside her since the night of the storm. It wasn't about a puppy or even a statue. It was about mercy finding us when we least expected it. The wind rustled softly through the square, carrying her words into the night. The Virgin's gaze remained as it always had, arms open, eyes lowered, but to those who were there, it felt as though heaven was listening. If this story touched you, don't leave it here. Share it, because sometimes all it takes is a story to remind us that miracles walk among us.